we put men and women under a brain scan, is there much difference between a woman's brain and a man's brain?
This study pulled MRI data from lots of different countries around the world, and it turned out when there's more equality, male and female brains are more similar in structure.
Dr. Sarah McKay is a neuroscientist translating brain and hormone science to support women's health.
I don't think I've had or heard any conversation that said that parts of our memory and cognition can actually expand in menopause.
It's not very trendy or sexy to talk about the upsides. There's a whole group of women whose brains are adapting and responding and flexing and adjusting. It's almost as if it got thicker in some parts, which is opposite of what we see in puberty and pregnancy, whereby grey matter getting slightly thinner. In both those instances, that's involved with streamlining and refining and the brain becoming more efficient. We see that those brain networks start to integrate even more as they are kind of responding to the loss of that estrogen.
There's so many stereotypes of men and women.
Yeah.
Women are always kind of touted as the more emotional and men more rational.
We've got some pretty clear data saying and showing that men's emotions don't fluctuate more wildly than women's.
That's really surprised me because I feel like I'm more emotional before my period.
The lowest reported rate of PMS in the world was in France, and it was 12%, but it was all the way up in the sort of 90% in Iran. There appears to be enormous cultural variation whether women have this experience or not. I was like, how can it be a purely biological phenomenon?
Firstly, I want to say thank you to tuning in and listening to the show. It means a huge amount. And connecting with all of you is something that I absolutely love as part of this journey of growing the show. One of my biggest goals of 2025 is doubling the reach of this show. And I can't do that without your support. So I would love to ask you a favor. If you can press subscribe or follow on whichever platform you listen to. This helps us reach more people. And for me, elevating women in science is so fundamental and ethical and scientific information. So if you feel the show empowers you and gives you the information that you've been seeking, I would love to ask a favor in return and to hit that subscribe button and help me reach the goal that I've set for the show of 2025. Thank you. Sarah, welcome to Live Well Be Well.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm very excited today because we're going to talk all about women's health, women's brains, neuroscience.
Yes.
Now, I think many people, well, I know the listeners of this show will know how underfunded women's health is. And I really want to start with looking at men and women structurally and their brain. So if we put men and women under a brain scan, is there much difference between a woman's brain and a man's brain? Because all I've got in my brain at the moment is men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Yes, and if you opened up a man's skull, inside is a blue brain and a woman's inside is a pink brain, and they're completely separate, that's not really how we think about things. So the way I like to describe male versus female brains is, and we need to get back to just quickly defining sex and gender, so remind me to come back to that, just so we don't get in
I'm going to make a note right now.
Don't get ourselves in a quagmire.
Okay.
Is this idea that we contain multitudes, and so do our brains. So if you were to measure a brain and compare one brain to another brain, you have said put it under a brain scanner, but like, what are you measuring even under a brain scanner? You could measure 100 different things. You could measure like the entire volume of the brain or the size or the shape. You could zoom in and look at specific parts of the brain. How thick is the cortex? What is the volume of that subnuclei? You could use a different type of brain imaging technology like fMRI, functional MRI, and you could look at how do different networks in the brain connect, which parts of the brain become activated or deactivated while you're performing certain tasks, or maybe just while you're sort of lying there thinking about nothing. You could look at how white and organised is the white matter. You could zoom on in and look at very, very specific components of grey matter, perhaps getting beyond the point of an MRI scanner or an MRI scanner. You could take a brain out, you could cut it up into little pieces and look at it under the microscope and count neurons, or look at synapses, or look at neuron number, or look at receptors. You could, there's so many different things. Yeah. And you could also then start going, well, what about perhaps risk factors for different types of diseases? So we could look at Tourette's syndrome or Alzheimer's disease or anxiety or depression or autism, a whole host of different factors like that, we could start doing different types of cognitive tests. So we've got hundreds of different types of measures that we could make of any one brain. And each of those measures, sometimes we might see a biological sex difference, in that we might see a difference between a male brain and a female brain. Often we won't see a biological sex difference. Sometimes when we see a difference, it's not an enormously big difference. Now, you'll be familiar, because you're a scientist, right? So if you've got like a normal distribution curve, a standard distribution, if you measured like 1,000 male brains and 1,000 female brains and you did start to see perhaps a biological sex difference, it's not as if the standard deviation curves are completely separate. Often there's a lot of overlap, and we're looking at very, very subtle differences. We're only going to start seeing those differences emerge when we're measuring lots and lots of brains. And then the next question is, well, if we are seeing in one of these 1,000 or 10 of these 1,000 measures some type of biological sex difference, is that a result of biological sex? Is that due perhaps to genes? Typically, most females are XX. Typically, most males are XY. Is it due to hormones? Is it due to in utero development? Is it due to pubertal sex development? Or is it due to some type of experiences that you've had growing up and living in a gendered world, the experiences that you have as a male or female living in the world you do? So we've got lots and lots and lots of measures we can make, and sometimes we might see subtle sex differences, but we're not necessarily always sure where they're from. So there's a couple of ways I like to kind of extend this idea out. And one is to say we were looking at lots of brains from different people all around the world of different life stages and ages. So say I was just in Dublin, Ireland this morning. So say you've got an 8-year-old girl living in Dublin and she loves Taylor Swift. And then you've got, last week I was in Boston, so you've got a young guy, he's 18 years old, he's got a lacrosse scholarship to Harvard. And then you could go to, say, rural India, and you've got a woman who's 35 and she's on her 3rd pregnancy. You could go to Argentina and look at a high court judge, or a very well experienced lawyer, professional. You could go to New Zealand, where I grew up. You could have a lady who's 93 in a nursing home. So are you going to compare each of their brains and look for differences and then assume that the only difference between all of those people is solely due to biological sex? Or is it due to the life experiences that they have? So it starts to become a whole lot more complicated than men have got male brains over here and women have got female brains over there. And there's this really fascinating study which was published a couple of years ago now that I always like to share. It was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, or PMS as we like to call it, 2023. And what we're starting to see is a little bit more sophistication in the thinking and the data sharing. And you might be familiar with, how medical research is going now. We're not just looking at data from one lab analysed in an Excel spreadsheet. We're starting to pool data. And this study pooled MRI data from lots of different countries around the world. I believe there was about 28 countries. And then each of those countries was given a score based on the gender equality or gender inequality of that country. And then they looked at male brains and female brains, and they were looking at MRI, and then they were looking at volumes of certain parts of these brains. And it turned out that when there was more gender equality in a country, and this is like, say, the Nordic Scandinavian countries versus, say, Turkey or Brazil, at least in this study, those were the countries that had less equality. When there's more equality, male and female brains are more similar in structure. When there was more gender inequality, male and female brains were more different in structure. And the male brains in all of the countries around the world were kind of pretty similar. It was the female brains in countries where there were less opportunities for girls growing up, less opportunities for education, less opportunities for what we might call enriched experiences, employment, and then perhaps like the stress of the inequality as well. That appears to have impacted those female brains to become more different from the male brains. So here we've got biological sex interacting with the experiences that you have to create a measurable difference in sexes, but it depends on the experiences you have. So I think we need to start asking more sort of sophisticated questions around, are male brains like this and female brains like that, and are they completely different? Instead, understand that there are hundreds of different measures we could make of any individual brain. There are hundreds of different types of lives lived around the world, and rather than male brains are blue and female brains are pink and they're completely different, brains are pieced together with a lot of stories.
Like a mosaic.
Yeah. And, sometimes there are very clear differences that we know are due to biological sex, well, at least average differences. And some of the clearest are, size overall. A male brain is larger than a female brain by about kind of 5 or 6%. Some of that can be accounted for by body size. A male brain's driving a bigger body around the world than a female brain. But we could sort of zoom in and go, well, actually, often what we see is that female brains have a little more grey matter and male brains have a little more white matter. We can look at cognitive test scores. That's sometimes where we start to see biological sex differences. We know that males, on average, the average male is better at rotating a 3D object in their mind's eye, whereas females, on average, are often better at like kind of verbal gymnastics or verbal recall. But then you could do like a battery of cognitive tests and, the majority of them will show no sex differences. So it's a very long-winded answer to what might appear to be a simple question, but I think we need to start being a little bit more careful about how we ask that, and that's my, I hope, careful, thoughtful answer to the question.
It is. Well, I just remember growing up with that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And it was something when I was just thinking about starting this conversation. We've had the brain docs on here talking about, that structurally there's not much difference, but they were saying that we might have more empathy. But I also think there's so many stereotypes of men and women.
Yeah.
And women are always kind of touted as the more emotional and men more rational. And is there actually science to back that up? Because I do think women are maybe more emotionally intuitive. Is the word I want to say.
So one of the researchers I spoke to for Women's Brain Book, kind of the second edition of that, has actually taken a look at that. Her name's Adrienne Beltz, and she's gone and she did some really interesting studies because there is this stereotype, women are more emotional, men are more rational. Like you invited me onto this podcast, I think we both made quite a rational decision to be here today. And the example I often give is like if you get yourself in some road rage incident, it's not me that's raging, it's usually some dude in a, tradie ute behind me. So, men can be deeply emotional and irrational. They're silly little anecdotes. But so Adrienne Beltz has done this particular study where she's been very, very methodical and careful to look at women. Let's look at women over the course of their menstrual cycle, because that's kind of where this idea that we're irrational and useless comes from, and look at women different, days of the menstrual cycle, women on the pill, and then compare them to men, and looks to see how much emotions vary across the course of the day, the week, the month, and in these different states. And she's found no difference in the highs and the lows and the emotional fluctuations between women across the course of the month, whether women are on the pill or not, and then in comparison to men. So we've got some pretty clear data saying and showing that men's emotions don't fluctuate more wildly than women's. And certainly then underlying that, she was trying to dig into the idea of, well, is the basis of this stereotype that it's our hormones that are driving our emotions, as if we're all on this emotional roller coaster we can't get off. And that hasn't played out or been supported in her data. And typically these stereotypes that we hear have come from these sort of long-held beliefs of, female hysteria. And I think some of us still perhaps unwittingly hold on to that, whereby I see this real sense or story out there that as soon as girls hit puberty, and also boys, but more so girls, we sort of start to attribute every emotional shift they have to hormones. And if it's not puberty blues, it's you're cranky before your period, you've got baby brain, you've got brain fog at menopause, you're depressed, you're weepy, you're irrational. And it's almost as if we have this female body and brain, and then we dose it up with some hormones and it automatically equals emotional instability and irrationality. And I mean, that's not been my personal experience of life, but it's a story that we persist in telling. And I don't think that the data backs that up.
Because that's also really surprised me, because I feel like I'm more emotional before my period. I think my friends that are going through perimenopause, all the people that have kind of written in about the show have always said, they feel like they're a totally different person going through this and they can't relate to themselves and they feel really lost. So am I getting it that maybe that's not right?
I think that we have to be really careful that we don't make some people's stories everyone's stories, and there's mass individual variation.
Okay.
And PMS obviously is different from perimenopause, and maybe we'll kind of unpack all of these.
Yeah, we need to.
Kind of across the lifespan ideas as we go along. But I think, first of all, it's pretty important to make clear that there is individual variation, but that doesn't mean everyone is the same and everyone is emotionally unstable. PMS is a really interesting thing. When I was writing my first book, I was really interested in, because I wanted to take a look at, if we have this menstrual cycle and we have these hormones and we hear all these stories about how this impacts and drives our brain primarily to its detriment, and we can talk about cognition, but by and large the story is that we do not have any data that supports the idea that cognition varies at any point across the menstrual cycle. And the very careful studies that have been done have supported this more recently, and then we can go all the way back to the 50s and 60s when we tend to think that women's brain health has been largely ignored, but even back in the 50s and 60s we were doing cognitive testing on women across the course of the menstrual cycle, doing things like finger tapping speed, secretarial type skills, where we're not seeing any variation in cognitive scores across the menstrual cycle.
Iron is one of the most common deficiencies that I see in clinic, especially in women. And it's not just about feeling tired. Low iron can impact your energy, your focus, your mood, and even your immune system. It's something we really need to be aware of, because if left untreated, iron deficiency can become very serious. Now, UK data shows that around 20 to 35% of women aged 18 to 50 do not meet the recommended dietary guidelines for iron intake. And if you're pregnant, menstruating, or following a vegetarian or vegan diet, your needs are even higher, and therefore you're more at risk. So that's why I often recommend Spartone. Now, this is a naturally sourced iron-rich water that comes from the Welsh Hills. It contains ferrous iron, the most absorbable form, with studies showing up to 40% absorption. So your body can actually use what it takes in. Now, it's also incredibly gentle. It's one natural ingredient, there's no harsh tablets, and there's no digestive issues. I use it myself, and it is my go-to in clinic. You can pick up Spartone at Boots, and if you've been feeling low in energy, it's absolutely worth checking in on your iron with your doctor or GP. So why do some people struggle?
Well, emotions are something different, right? And so I think PMS is interesting because emotions are quite subjective. And when I first set out to go, well, how many women have PMS and feel emotionally unstable, angry or cranky or irritable leading up to their periods? What's the percentage? Like, it can't be all of us. It can't be none of us. It must be somewhere in between. And I found this fascinating meta-analysis that was pulled together rates of PMS, self-reported PMS. So this is women saying, yes, I have this, before their periods, and it looked at all different countries in the world. And so the lowest reported rate of PMS in the world was in France, and it was 12%. So 12% of women put their hands up and go, yes, that is me. Jump over the border to Spain, it was about 33%. Global average was around 50%, but it was all the way up in the sort of 90% in Iran. And lots of other countries fell in between. And I was like, how can this be? How can it be a purely biological phenomenon that's objective, that's measurable, if rates vary from 12% to 90% globally? There must be a very subjective, cultural, storytelling, expectation component to it. And that's not to dismiss it, but it's to say there appears to be enormous cultural variation whether women have this experience or not. And there's another study I always like to discuss that actually came out of New Zealand, where I grew up. And there's been a few different sort of studies of this type where women have, the studies have gone in and looked at, sort of cycle days. Some of them will measure women's blood to check that it is precisely the cycle day that they say it is, because women we might know, my period started 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday. That may mean I'm at day whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean you're pre or post ovulation. What we need to do is very careful blood testing to make sure we're looking at precisely the right type of day. And then ask women to self-report their emotional state. But be very careful when we're getting self-reports of emotions that we're giving women positive emotions, neutral emotions, and negative emotions, and an equal distribution of each of those to choose from. So we're not giving them 18 negative emotions to choose from, one neutral and one positive, because it's always going to skew the data. So we need to be very careful how we're gathering that data. And in the careful studies that have been done, where women are not necessarily told we're doing a study on PMS, we're just looking at emotion in daily life, the rate of clear emotional variation is very low. It's much more like women in France, interestingly. Wow. Yeah, versus the sort of 90% rate of women in Iran, for example, somewhere in between. And lots of people find this quite confronting, and I'm just sort of sharing the data here, and I talked about this at length with a couple of the researchers that have worked in the space, and one of them said we saw a much more clear variation in emotions, not based on menstrual cycle day, but based on an overall sense of well-being, like what's your kind of health and well-being like today? What's your physical health like today? How stressed are you feeling today? And how socially supported and connected are you feeling today? And emotions varied far more with those metrics than with the metric of purely cycle day. But there's a story that we tell here, and I'm not saying this is all in women's heads. And I spoke to one of the researchers, Sarah Romans, about this and said, "Are you saying that PMS is made up in a woman's head?" She said, No. She said, "But I think what we need to do is we need to look very carefully at what is causing emotions to vary. What stories are we telling ourselves, and how can we look at the data that we each have available to see what is driving an emotion?" Because it's not always a hormone in everyone. And we know that there are some women who have hormone sensitivity, and emotions do ride that kind of wave of hormone fluctuations and variations. But there's also many women who don't, who perhaps have kind of landed on this idea that maybe I should get PMS and therefore I experience that. Your expectations are an enormous part of the experiences that you have.
Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett spoke about this on the projection of your emotions on past memories and experiences on the show, which was really interesting.
100%. And her idea is that our emotions are constructed from the signals from our body, the context in which we're in, and the experiences we have and the words we use to describe them. And that's not to say that they aren't real experiences, but sometimes we can there's a few more data points in there which might sort of change that shift. And I think I just want to be very clear that PMS is real, and the more severe form of PMDD is real.
Yes, that's horrific.
But this isn't an experience in all women all of the time. There are some women who have hormone sensitivity, but there are many women who don't. And I sometimes wonder if we were telling ourselves different stories, we might have different experiences. Maybe there's a different cultural narrative in France versus Iran. There is a long-standing feminist narrative around this, and the sort of feminist literature is not really my expertise, but I've looked into it sort of lightly, that says that women kind of self-silence or kind of hold their emotions in, and then there's this 1 week a month when they can kind of let it all out because they're kind of allowed to, and that may kind of inform some women's experiences more so than others. But I think it's important to realise that the hormones are not the only data point which are constructing an emotion, as Lisa Feldman Barrett would say. The stories are part of that, the cultural narratives we've got, the expectations we've got.
I think it's a much more nuanced discussion, isn't it? I think the importance of women feeling recognised who haven't for so long in this area where it is related to hormones
100%
is really important. But as you said, I think you said something there which was really interesting, and I'm thinking about the women in Iran versus the women in France and the amount of stress that the women in Iran may have compared to the women in France, culturally. And
maybe French women can just be pissed off any day of the month. They feel like it.
yeah.
You know, maybe, and that's a massive cultural stereotype we've just used there. But maybe this
women's rights, it's very different in Iran
100%
than it is in France.
Maybe there's something in there, and that's an extreme example. But that was that meta-analysis, and research that's kind of followed along behind that is looking at these experiences that we have. We've looked at the emergence of mood disorders perhaps during puberty and the emotional experiences girls have and boys have going through puberty. And I mean, we can dig into that a little bit more if you like. But again, we tend to zone in on the hormones as if they're the only data point or the only they're driving the car and we don't have any agency over anything else that matters. Some women definitely have hormone sensitivity, but we have to be very, very careful that we don't make everyone's story the same.
Well, that's a projection, isn't it, when we're doing that? I think there's two things that I find really interesting connected to this, right? Which is we know anxiety and depression are more common in women. So women are nearly twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And this was in your new book. A 2021 meta-analysis showed that progesterone, a hormone unique to female reproductive cycle, can make a traumatic emotional memories more sticky in women, meaning they're harder to forget or suppress. So that, I guess, is related to hormones because it's progesterone. And then what I found was another really interesting study in your book. So we're flipping to adolescence now, which is, and I know these are your favourite studies because you say them in the book as well, which is in 2018, a Swedish study of over 800,000 women found that the oral contraceptive pill increased the risk of depression, but only in adolescent girls, not adult women. So putting that into the hormone kind of umbrella and also the mental health umbrella as well, how can we then connect what you've just said to that research?
So I think if we're looking at, say, anxiety and depression, they're kind of like sisters holding hands.
Yeah.
I don't know whether me and my sister always hold hands, but they're
Nice
related.
image.
They often kind of go hand in hand. And typically this data has to come from large-scale population analyses, looking at thousands of people, whereby we would see that there's a greater risk or diagnosis of anxiety and depression in girls post-puberty compared to boys and men. Girls and women post-puberty and boys and men. Before puberty, it's pretty even, and then we start to see a split. What are the causes or the risk factors for, say, anxiety and depression? And this is almost going back to what Lisa Feldman Barrett said. I always talk about, based on a biopsychosocial model, what's happening in our bodies, hormones being one part of that, what's happening in the world around us, the people we interact with, the social experiences we have, the lived world the built world we live in, and then our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviours. And all of these different variables kind of add up to, across a population there being more girls and women diagnosed with anxiety and depression than boys and men. Boys and men, of course, get anxiety and get depression.
They also have the highest risk of suicide as well.
They do. So up into puberty, those sort of stats are pretty, they're pretty diagnosable at the same rate. And I think puberty is super interesting because we've got sex hormones. So we've got the boys start experiencing the testosterone and the girls start experiencing the estrogen and progesterone. And that is going to be one of those building blocks that kind of makes that difference there. But we're also going to have very, very different experiences of life going forwards. And I think that the study that I love to talk about in puberty, which I think might not initially seem to, but I think does shed some light on this, looks at the emotional experiences of boys and girls sort of starting puberty based on the sort of the social world in which they live. So we know that girls that go through puberty earlier than their friendship group, say they have breast development at, say, around age 9 and have their period at age 10, that's still in the early but normal distribution, right? They're young, but it's not unhealthy. It's not precocious puberty. Those girls in particular are much more vulnerable to go on to develop anxiety and depression than a girl who goes through puberty the same age as the rest of her friendship group, so that she gets a period at 12 and a half or a little bit later, say 14. A boy who goes through puberty earlier than his friendship group is not as vulnerable. He might take a few more kind of risks because boys are more likely, not not only likely to, but more likely to engage in sort of sensation seeking and risk taking. But a boy who goes through puberty earlier than his friendship group, well, what happens to him? He gets taller, he gets hairier, his voice drops, he kind of almost becomes, he rises in social stature in his friendship group. So he's kind of protected emotionally versus the boy who goes through puberty later than his friendship group. So what you've got here is pubertal hormones affecting these bodies and brains for the first time. Brains go through puberty too. Bodies go through puberty too. But the girl going through puberty is the one who's vulnerable. So she's experiencing pubertal hormones. Her brain is going through puberty. It's setting off into this adolescent trajectory through to adulthood. But her body is changing, and she knows her body is changing, and she's starting to look at herself differently. She's starting to understand that other people are going to look at her differently in ways she may not want or feel comfortable with. And she's going to be very aware of how she fits in with her social circle. And that's going to increase that risk of anxiety and depression. But it wasn't just the hormones.
It's the social context.
It's the social context, but it's also her reflection of the social context and her interactions with other people and the meaning that she's making of that. So all of those factors are contributing to her, say, developing depression or anxiety, more so perhaps than the boy who's experienced puberty early.
So it's more so than just the hormones.
So it's like what I was talking about, the male-female brain differences at the beginning. It's not going to be just one thing. When we're looking at a population, these statistics are drawn from populations of people. We've got lots of pieces that are kind of contributing to that. And then these, we've got the male brain and we've got the female brain, and they're experiencing kind of the brain turns on, the testes or the ovaries, they start producing the sex hormones that change the body and then kind of send this brain off through this trajectory of adolescent brain development. And we see all of the kind of refinement and changes and, brain structure and brain function, and kind of tracking alongside those changes, we see the development of lots of different kinds of ways of thinking and feeling and behaving. And that's when we do start to see age kind of 14, 15 is when we start to see the emergence of mental health problems. And the biggest risk factor, once you're outside the other side of puberty for developing anxiety or depression, is having experienced it before. So it's almost like, all of these kind of pieces in a puzzle or building bricks in a wall start to add up. And that's where we start to see this divergence in these rates of diagnosis. And we've also then got, although it's, depends where you are in the world around sort of mental health awareness, I suppose, accessibility to being able to get diagnosed, willingness to go and ask for help.
And also, I guess, how your parents acknowledge the difference between females and males. I think it's really interesting kind of like hearing this. I mean, I know you've done so much on the lifespan of women, but there is so much social conditioning. I mean, I grew up watching Disney films, kind of thinking that you would get married and have babies and that would be your career. I guess my mum kind of met my father. They've been married 50 years at 15 and had a baby and got married. I've had a very different life. But it's interesting thinking about maybe people that grew up with maybe strong entrepreneurial parents or the mother that stayed at home. There's so many different scenarios, especially maybe in the millennial generation when things are starting to change a lot more than maybe my parents' generation, like the baby boomers. So it's interesting to kind of think like how these have such a mix. Now I'm thinking about how women's roles are changing. So like putting into context everything that you said, which I'm finding really fascinating, maybe kind of dispelling the myth that most of our kind of emotional awareness or distress is maybe not just down to hormones, it's down to the projections and the social context that we're in. Now women's roles are changing. More women are finishing university than men with higher results. Women are, I don't know if we're having less children. I don't think we are statistically, but I think women are being more conscious about when they're having children than before. There's less marriages happening. So the kind of social context of society is changing. The man and the woman's roles are changing. They're becoming both workers and supporting families, more than so than ever before. So I'm kind of thinking about this projection in the next 30 years of what you're now telling me, which is making me kind of think, okay, well, I know there's more funding now going into women's health than there was maybe 10 years ago. Not enough, but a little bit more. There's a bit more awareness, there's more conversation. And the social construct is slightly changing. How do you think that's going to impact how women will look at their health and how they'll be feeling? Do you think if we are changing the social construct, we're going to be having less PMS symptoms?
I don't know. I suppose it depends on the stories that we're going to be telling ourselves. I mean, I think sometimes, even with the best of intentions, we still sometimes tell stories that perhaps inadvertently have a negative consequence or outcome. So I often talk about a lot of these ideas are just based on these stereotypes that just become perpetuated over time, like this idea that we're all just at mercy of our hormones and women are so much more emotional. Our emotions have so much more variation. Some of the other research, and I'm sure you've read about it in the book, I talk about these sort of stereotypes that children are raised and when they sort of we start to see, I mean, boys, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, boys and men have more self-confidence and belief in themselves. And we start to see that diverge around ages sort of 6 or 7. At least in the country, there's studies have been done whereby it's like, well, who's going to be smart? Who's going to grow up to, be a scientist or, whatever kind of role model, which is perceived as like kind of smart or intellectual or have a high IQ. And boys everywhere in the world kind of think, well, that'll be me, and girls sort of start to lose that belief kind of in their primary school years. At least some of them will sort of start to doubt themselves, and there's nothing sort of biological happening there. But there's some really interesting research that's looking at this idea of the implicit messaging that kids are still picking up about gendered stereotypes or occupations or intelligence. And we use language, and I even caught myself yesterday when I was out with my husband and brother and sister-in-law, and I said, we can't say, well, girls are good at maths too, or girls can also be scientists, because even that—
Girls are scientists.
The implicit message in there is that this is this boy thing that girls are opting into, like the boys are the norm, but girls also can, instead of saying girls and boys have equal ability at maths. Men and women are equally capable scientists. Men and women, boys and girls can grow up to be scientists, not like girls can too. By saying girls can too, we're kind of giving this message that maybe someone thinks we can't, but the boys are going to, so we're kind of jumping in on their
parade
world. So I think sometimes even when we have good intentions—
it's unconscious, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, kids just, swim in the world, what's the idea if you're a fish in a bowl, you don't know that you're swimming in water. I can't remember the sort of analogy there. And I think sometimes we can, with the best of intentions, create experiences for little people that are giving them messages that we don't want them to receive. So how are those messages going to change? And it's very hard for me to kind of untangle my experiences out of it as well, because I grew up not even thinking about the fact that I was a girl who could or couldn't do things based on my sex. I just never considered sex and gender until perhaps the last 10 years. It never occurred to me not to go to university and study science. I just thought it was cool and interesting, and off I went. And perhaps because I went into the neurosciences, and there's always been gender equity in neuroscience, it's perhaps more like the sort of the psychological or biological or medical sciences. There's always been gender parity. It wasn't like I was going off to study maths or physics or engineering where it was apparent. So it never occurred to me at any time in my academic or education to not do something, because I just never—
because you're a girl.
I just didn't even think about it.
Well, I
honestly never considered it.
See, I find it interesting because I don't think that my time at school was because of my sex differences. I think it's because I was an undiagnosed dyslexic, and so I just didn't like school. But then this is something I find really interesting. So I was then scouted as a model when I was 15. Now, the modelling industry is unlike any other industry out there for one big reason that you might not realise. Women have a hierarchy than men. They get paid more than men. They're wanted more than men. They're in more demand. So men are kind of second to women. in this, and it's all about women are bigger consumers, they buy more, so a lot of money is filtered to paying more for women models. It's kind of more of their industry. So from a very young age of 16, the women had the power more than the men. And I say that in such like a kind of a derogative way, but I guess coming out of that industry where women, which is very different to, I think, the outer world of the pay system with men versus women. Men have always been known to be paid more, have more of the CEO jobs. But I went into an industry where women kind of held that. So for me, it was quite an empowering that when I was coming out of it, I was really seeing the difference between men and women.
Interesting. And and it's very hard not to have your own personal lens and bias on this. And I try very hard to when I'm doing the work that I'm doing. But I mean, I'm sure it inadvertently comes in. I guess I just kind of lucked out with the upbringing I had and just kind of the path that I followed. And it's only been more recently I've come to, well, not everyone has the same experiences and the same, and I just have had a lot of good luck come my way. So I'm now becoming more aware, let's just say, of the inequalities that are out there, which is still huge. I suppose, like, just to kind of, because I mean, I can't comment on, I mean, that's not really my sort of jam, just to sort of talk about, like, bring it back to the science and think about the gender inequalities, or at least the non-recognition of women's health and biological sex as a variable. I think what's really cool is that I have this optimism bias. I always like to look at the strengths. Like, we know there's a gap, right?
Yeah.
We talk endlessly about this gap. Like, it's almost getting a little bit boring to talk about the gap, because what is good is that we are filling the gap with data. We're trying really, really hard, and there are some extraordinary scientists out there, and many of them are women. I call them the women of steel. Lots of them are Gen X. Call out to my girls.
Yes.
Who like, you know, they've stuck at it. I didn't. They have stuck at it, and they're like at the point now where they can ask the questions, get the research funding in, the little bit of research funding that's out there. They're doing their best with it and getting the answers to fill these gaps. And that has come about because, especially in the neuroscience space, there are like so many women in there now that are high enough up that ranking to be able to start asking questions that the guys never really thought about. And that's what's been like wild is in the last sort of, since I really started writing about women's health from a neuroscience perspective in 2015, to see how much that has shifted in the last 10 years. It is wild, but it is crazy that the research has only started to emerge. But also selfishly, I then get to like watch it and talk about it. If it came out 30 years ago, it would be old news.
Well, you wrote your first book, Women's Brain, in 2018, but you're just about to do the second edition now. Yes. It's just coming out, literally, probably as this episode drops. So I really wanted to know, like, even in that, I mean, say it's a short space of time, it's not, but, you know, it's under 10 years. What was kind of the biggest change or revelation that you saw that you think is so important for women to know? Because it's changing so rapidly and so quickly.
Well, I think what's important to know is that we know that there's a gap and there's lots of amazing people doing really good work to fill it. I think technology is also kind of tracked alongside, you know, the research coming in, the questions, and then the answers. And we're starting to understand that power comes from numbers, right? Like, just to be a total nerdy scientist, like, we just need more data, but we've got some cool new ways to get data, which I love. So we've got what, you know, we told kids in primary school to do, and maybe it's taken the women to lead the way to share. And it used to be very much that each lab was siloed and you didn't really share the research information or data with anyone else, particularly raw data. And now we've got data sharing, we've got biobanks, we've got collaborations. So instead of, you know, 10 people in this lab being studied and 10 people in another lab being studied on the other side of the world and 15 over there, now we can pull all of that together. The data is being shared. There is power in numbers.
What was the most surprising part of that you saw though? Like, when you were writing the second edition, were you like, I didn't think I'd write about this?
I just think that, and it sounds so nerdy, but just the fact that we are starting to see signals emerge from the data that we couldn't see before because we didn't have enough of it. So, and we've now got technology like machine learning and AI that can analyze that data and can start to pick up signals that perhaps we couldn't necessarily see before. And so I've included a lot of that data in the book. So, I mean, like to just kind of think off the top of my head what would have been. So there's one study which I haven't talked about a lot that comes out of work from a woman, Pauline McKay, a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, women's health researcher who's looked at brain fog during menopause. And this is like this big topic. And again, if you're told you get to 48 and you're going to get brain fog, you're going to experience it. Like we do create our own realities, but also it is real and it is measurable, but not in everyone all of the time. So they had a cohort. It was a small longitudinal study whereby they looked at a group of women and followed them the whole way through perimenopause and menopause and kind of out the other side, and did tons of different cognitive tests on them at multiple times all the way through this sort of perimenopause transition. And the cognitive tests were designed to pick up different aspects of kind of memory and attention and thinking, all the sorts of functions that our brain does that we might feel aren't working as well when we say we have brain fog. And brain fog's a very big umbrella word, like a constellation of symptoms, a bit like baby brain, where we might just like, my brain isn't working. But like people who haven't slept much might say they have brain fog, or perhaps people with depression might have brain fog, or, you know, we use it quite loosely. And it turns out that not every woman shows cognitive decline across this time course. Machine learning was able to analyze this data and kind of come up with these like kind of 4 subgroups or buckets of women showing these different kind of trajectories across the menopause transition. Some women, their cognition stayed the same. Like, did all these tests the whole way through, and they just sort of stayed the same as they were. There was one small group of women who showed a slight reduction in some of their test scores across that menopause transition, and they were much more likely to have poor levels of education, have terrible sleep, and to also have lots of other kind of constellation of symptoms going through menopause. But then there was 2 groups of women who actually showed improvements in their test scores.
And through menopause?
And in a way that might not, well, probably shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise. Not every test score, but, you know, some tests of memory and some tests of attention actually improved. But when you do cognitive testing multiple times, your test scores get better. And we tell this story about brain fog, but that's not every woman's experience all of the time. And it's not until we've got really rigorous data analysis, we've got lots of data points, and then we use sophisticated ways to analyze it, we have these new stories starting to emerge that I think show that, again, we're not just reaching this reproductive life transition that automatically equals dysfunction and decline and instability and things going wrong. Brains shift and shape and reorganize and respond. And our, you know, you'd be familiar with this word, even just this word brain plasticity. Our brains reorganize and react and often show quite a great deal of resilience over time. But we're just not telling these stories. And I saw similar types of stories emerge when we're talking about pregnancy and motherhood and baby brain, and even just aging and memory across the lifespan. Data is starting to reveal some really new and interesting stories that aren't always about dysfunction and decline.
I think that gives, okay, so there's one study that I read in your book, and I'm jumping in the lifespans here, but listeners, stay with me. We're now on menopause.
I'm jumping as well.
We're going everywhere, but it's, you know, that's the journey of life. Menopause. So I went to this Women's Health Summit in LA, and I mean, for a woman in her 30s, being very much in the sphere, I'm informed about menopause now.
You're probably petrified at the moment.
But I'm petrified.
Yeah.
And I can see these
2 years ago, you wouldn't have, menopause wasn't invented. I joke and I say menopause wasn't invented, but yes.
But I also really don't want to undermine women that are really struggling. And I actually do have some friends who can call me in tears because they feel like they've completely lost who they are and they feel very alone. And so I guess I'm kind of in the weeds of kind of wanting to understand the science behind this. But I remember sitting at this Women's Health conference only a couple of months ago with some incredible scientists and showing the decline of the brain on the screen and going, this is what happens when you hit 35. This is what happens when you hit 45. And the surface of the brain declining So I'm obviously naturally, as anyone probably listening to the show and anyone who is very deep in the menopause space, pretty scared about what's meant to happen. And then I read this part in your book, which said the first brain image study tracking women from perimenopause to postmenopause came out in 2021. It showed that some areas of grey matter expanded, especially in the regions of the brain linked to memory and cognition. So I was like, it's not loss, it's adaptation, which I don't think I've had or heard any conversation that said that parts of our memory and cognition can actually expand in menopause.
It's not very trendy or sexy to talk about the upsides.
That's what we want to talk about.
And I think that this is a problem, like overall with women's health being under-researched, is that we really need to focus in on solving problems, and I understand that, and finding solutions for women who are struggling. But again, there's a whole group of women whose brains are adapting and responding and flexing and adjusting. And the menopause story that's often, and to be clear, we have very few good brain imaging studies looking at how women's brains change across the menopause. And the study that you're talking about was Lisa Mosconi's study. And
She's
to be
great.
clear, this was not a longitudinal study that followed a group of women all the way through. It compared a group of premenopausal women, perimenopausal women, and another group of postmenopausal women, and also men of the same age. So ideally, we want longitudinal studies, because then we can see how one woman's brain changes and look at 1,000 women's brains, not get averages and compare between groups. But her study did show that if you looked at, say, grey matter volume in parts of the cortex, you saw it like a slight kind of reduction during perimenopause, and it kind of bounces back post-menopause. It's almost as if it got slightly thicker in some parts, which is crazy because that's kind of the opposite of what we see in puberty and pregnancy, whereby we see parts of the grey matter of cortex getting slightly thinner. And in both those instances, that's involved with kind of streamlining and refining and the brain just becoming more efficient. It appears to kind of, for want of a better word, bounce back slightly going through menopause. But that's just structure, actually. I think what's really fascinating is there's some very, very new studies that have come out looking at how brain networks change both over the natural course of aging and across the menopause, perimenopause transition as well. And we know during adolescence, brain networks become much more kind of efficient, and we've almost got these nodes that become kind of quite refined and good at doing their jobs. So they become very kind of segregated and efficient, with each different network being responsible for a different kind of role. And then through natural healthy aging, what we start to see is the networks become less segregated and more integrated. It's almost as if they kind of start to cooperate. And as the brain becomes slightly less efficient, perhaps metabolically less efficient, and perhaps is showing some kind of signs of just kind of cellular aging, as every part of our body does, it adapts and responds. And so the networks that used to be very segregated sort of start to integrate a little bit more. It's almost as if instead of, there being lots of little kind of individuals doing their own jobs, it's like, hey, guys, let's kind of work together as a team. And we see this with the hippocampus, and we know that there's kind of hippocampus in both, there's two hippocampus, one in either hemisphere of our brain, and that's involved with things like short-term memory and turning short-term memories into long-term memories. And typically one side of your hippocampus or the other will be doing jobs related with memory. And then as you go through menopause, we start to see both sides being activated together.
Double whammy.
Yeah, so it's reacting and responding. It's going, hey, we just need a little bit more brain power here, so how about let's recruit some more parts of the brain together to get the job done. Earlier in development, and as you learn new skills and get better at them, we tend to see less brain activity being required or less parts of the brain being recruited. And then as we age, we sort of start to have to recruit brain power back again. So the brain realizes and understands, hey, I've got to kind of involve more neurons here to get the job done so it can keep on doing the job. And we see that happening across menopause as well. And there are some studies that are reasonably new whereby we can almost track that with the loss of estrogen. So your ovaries are producing less estrogen, or roller coastering through perimenopause and then flatlining post-menopause, we see that those brain networks start to integrate even more as they are kind of responding to the loss of that estrogen.
So that's an interesting question because we haven't spoken about HRT yet and estrogen loss. But are these brains that are showing more positive effects, are these the women that have been on HRT?
No, these studies that have been done have only looked at women who are not taking HRT. Lisa Mosconi's study found it didn't matter. I mean, there's some complexities to that study whereby a lot of those women had, APO genes, which predispose them to Alzheimer's disease, etc. And it combined women on HRT and not, and it wasn't longitudinal. So I think what we need is a good, clear longitudinal study that's going to look at this. But these studies looking at network recruitment and integration across menopause have been done on women not on HRT.
Okay.
So that complicates it a bit. But I think what's really cool is we see this throughout healthy aging. We see this integration and we see different types of memory emerging and different strengths and different types of memory emerging at different ages, but we tend to focus in on that type of memory, that quick, sharp, short, problem-solving, fast, working memory, like the stuff that you peak at in your early 20s. I know what I was like in my early 20s. Now I've less to lose words. I'm at this point, I'm 50. I just run out of words sometimes, or I just use the wrong words. I'll say lid instead of hat, or I don't know, sticker instead of plate. They're kind of loosely related. There's some semantic mixing going on there. I think it's my networks integrating and distorting. But I have wisdom and I have life experience and I have the ability to connect dots between ideas and I have skills that I didn't have in my early 20s, but we don't tend to honour them and respect them and
as much as
and see them as strengths, in the same way that we do with the kind of the quick, short, sharp. We need
the quick
both.
and hustle bustle of society.
And I wonder, and I'm not sure whether this is the case, but I wonder. And I was speaking to a memory scientist, more in Irish, in Sydney recently, and I said, do you think that these skills that we see emerging later in life, the different types of memory strengths, are adaptive? It's not just coincidence. Maybe it's adaptive, I'm not having babies anymore. I'm not building a career. I'm not creating and, I'm kind of settling and making the most and passing on wisdom. Perhaps the memory for each life stage is the type of memory that humans as a species need. Socially, perhaps the wise matriarch, the older, wiser man, the guru, they're all older, wiser, slower, deeper thinking people who are imparting knowledge on to the younger generations to quickly build something with it. I don't know, maybe it's adaptive and we don't honour it.
I don't think we do because we live in a quicker, more fast-paced society than ever before.
We focus on what we've lost.
Yeah, well, this takes me similar back to the Compassionate Cure 5 questions for Substack, where we spoke about celebrating those wins when they happen and allowing yourself to be in that moment and not just think about the next thing. But I think so many women are going to be screaming at this podcast going, what about HRT in the brain?
Oh my goodness.
What I'm losing my words.
Yeah.
I'm literally losing my words.
I know what you want to know.
There's so many questions that I know women are going to be holding on to their phones or where they're listening saying, but is this good for my brain or not?
So this is so complicated because we've got data, we've got clinical practice guidelines, and we've kind of got lots of different ways in which we can go through menopause. Most of the information, there is different information and guidelines based on different sources of evidence for women who perhaps experience early menopause, say between the age of 40, before the age of 40, or perhaps say they have their ovaries removed, so they have cancer or a full hysterectomy before the age of 45, where there is different advice given to women going through, say, natural menopause at, say, 51 or whatever. And women have been taking different types of HRT or menopause hormone therapy over sort of different amounts of time and different generations. And so the data has got quite mixed and muddly. And that has meant that we can't always make these clear, definitive statements. Say we were looking at the best indication that we have, and the clearest sort of little biological mechanism, which I can explain to you, is taking hormone replacement therapy, estrogen, progesterone, because you've got vasomotor symptoms or hot flashes. And we understand very clearly the biological mechanism there. And I don't want to talk about
Isn't that one of like the smallest kind of physical symptoms?
Well, it's not the smallest physical symptom. It's
not one of them.
It's very. It can be very disruptive.
Okay.
And it is a neurological symptom.
Yeah.
Because it comes from your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus, deep in your brain, does all kinds of things, including regulating hormones, but it does things like heart rate and blood pressure and also body temperature. And lack of estrogen or roller coastering estrogen alters the hypothalamus thermostat. So the top goes down, the bottom goes up. So it takes a very little shift in body temperature, particularly to kind of hit that upper level, whereby your brain thinks, oh my goodness, it's really hot in this body, we need to cool it down, emergency situation.
Yes.
It's like overheating.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're younger, that shift in body temperature isn't going to go above the top level of the thermostat. And we know estrogen tweaks that, because when you put it back in, with HRT, it resets the thermostat back to normal levels.
Okay.
And so what happens is it might just feel like you go hot and sweaty during the day, and it can be annoying, but it has it can have a whole host of other knock-on effects. One of those is disrupting your sleep at night. Yeah. And we know about 70% of hot flashes experienced at night wake women up. And sometimes that's just because they're hot and sweaty and uncomfortable, but sometimes it's because they might be deeply asleep. And the hypothalamus is going, we don't want to just have a physiological cooling response. We need to behave in a way to cool ourselves down, but you are asleep, so I need to wake you up, so you throw the covers off. And so it sends out kind of this sympathetic nervous system response. And if you have ever had one at night, as a new, and I didn't put up with this for too long, don't worry about that, started to experience, it almost feels like you've been given a fright, because you have this rush of adrenaline kind of through your body, and you feel like you've got a fright, and it wakes you up enough to throw the covers off. And then if you're waking up with fright, it's hard to get back to sleep anyway, and then you get cold, and then you fall asleep, and you're cold, and you wake up, put the covers back on. It's just mucks up your sleep. So even if you are not waking up, it's still disrupting that nice, healthy sleep architecture, because we know that sleep architecture and body temperature are really intimately entwined. So imagine if that's just one night that I've described.
So that's going to be affecting the brain overall, because we know poor sleep also 100%. Really affects poor brain
and
health.
Then, so we've got hormones, thermoregulation, sleep. What happens with disrupted sleep? Brain fog, emotional instability, depression, anxiety. On top of that, there are a whole lot of nervous system and cardiovascular effects of having this repeated sympathetic nervous system activation over and over again. And we're a little bit unclear about the exact link and mechanisms by which it may be contributing to poor cardiovascular health. And we don't know whether it's because of the hot flashes are sort of sitting in there in between, or there's another biological mechanism. We're not quite sure what's the kind of the chicken and egg scenario there, or the first domino to fall, but there's definitely this kind of web of effects in there. And often that's why we see these kind of clusters or constellations of symptoms. So even if it is simply just due to the hot flashes, they are going to have a whole lot of different types of consequences, and we need more research, and there's people in there, sort of trying to untangle that web. And there are some new drugs which are being developed. So you want to treat your hot flashes, but you don't want to, or you can't take hormones. If we treat the hot flashes with a non-hormonal therapy, do we see improvements in sleep? Do we see improvements in brain fog? If the brain fog's a consequence of bad sleep. So you can kind of see how it gets pretty complicated in there. So I would never dismiss them as being a small symptom. That is the best.
Definitely not a small symptom. I just want to make sure that the listeners didn't think this was a small symptom. It's meant that I think most people related menopause just to hot flashes.
Yes.
And they're saying that's not the number one symptom of everyone who has menopause. That was more of my kind of stretching of the question.
That is the symptom in which we have the best indication for hormone therapy and what all the clinical practice guidelines would say. Brain fog is kind of confusing and difficult, because sometimes studies have been done where women have been treated with hormone replacement therapy and they don't feel their brain fog is improved. And so we're not entirely sure maybe those reorganisation of those networks that we're starting to see, perhaps that's kind of contributing to brain fog, and putting the hormones back in isn't going to make a difference. I don't know. That we've got a lot of complexities in there. The longer term effects, and this is where the data gets mixed and the messages are conflicting, we know that the older you get, the more likely you are to develop Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias, and that women have a higher risk later in life of, at least there's more women alive with Alzheimer's disease than there are men in their 80s and 90s. And part of that is due to living longer. Part of that is due to a whole host of life experiences that we have, from, rates of childhood education to rates of cardiovascular disease to, a whole host of biological sex and gendered factors which are contributing to that difference in risk, or at least prevalence. Part of it may be menopause, but it's not certainly the only case. If it was as simple as let's put hormones back in with HRT to prevent dementia, then the data would show that, or it would be very clear. It's not because the gap is there, it's because we've looked at that and the data is really conflicting. Some studies show women who are taking HRT, we're seeing an increased risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Some women, we're seeing a decreased risk. Some studies are showing, look, it's not really going to make a difference one way or another. And what is causing those conflicting studies is because we've got different types of women who perhaps are starting taking HRT at different points in that kind of menopause transition. Perhaps they're taking different types of kinds of hormone therapies. Women who are in their 80s and 90s now may have started taking hormone therapy in the 1980s or 90s.
Which is a very different type
and it was a different type of hormone therapy than that women are taking now. And there are a lot of contributing factors to Alzheimer's disease risk. We've got some women with a genetic predisposition, other women not. So the data is really mixed, and it is certainly not clear enough for any menopause society, and certainly for me as someone who's looked at the data, to say HRT will prevent dementia. It's not going to cause dementia, might be neutral, we don't really know. I think that there are other risk factors which are far clearer and are much louder emerging from the data that are risk factors for Alzheimer's and dementia that we just don't want to talk about because they're really unsexy. And things like hearing loss at midlife. 7% of cases of Alzheimer's disease globally could be prevented by treating midlife hearing loss. That is just the most boring story. No one wants to talk about hearing loss. Isn't going to drive a social media algorithm. Lack of education in early childhood, 5% of cases. Perhaps it's the girls lacking the education, and perhaps the low middle income countries which are contributing to that risk. No one wants to talk about educating girls versus it's far more kind of glamorous and of the moment. Menopause is having its moment. That is great, but the data is not clear enough to say anything about HRT and dementia.
I think the fact that you said that doesn't cause it or is not going to escalate it is maybe really settling for women to hear.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a big conversation. As you said, I'm so happy we're having these conversations around women's health. I think women are starting to feel seen after years of not feeling unseen. But it is such a confusing Wild West out there. So much about it is, I think, everything is so individual. As we were saying in the beginning, every brain is mosaic. It has its own tapestry of life put together. Allowing women to maybe try and test something and become connected to how they're feeling, I guess, is their own case study during this, and having a very good physician that will listen to them and understand them. Maybe a woman who is also empathetic to what the other individual's going through.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important to say that the science is still hyper unclear in this area.
And as a scientist, for me, I'm okay with that. But I know that for other people, it's harder to sit with the uncertainties. There are some things that we are certain about. So I guess it's easy for me to kind of say the data is mixed and we don't know. But that's not because we're hiding information from people or there's disagreements. It's when data is mixed. Let's be clear about data being mixed and being okay with that. And sometimes there are plenty of things that we can do to promote brain health across the lifespan. And I've written like books on this.
Well, I want you, because sadly, we're going to have to get you back on. Because
we didn't even talk about pregnancy and motherhood.
Because we've run out of time. And
That's why you need to be a bro podcast so we can go for 3.5 hours.
I know, we're the anti-bro podcast, this podcast, but we have great conversations. But I do want to leave, like, if you could give women one main tip to take from today to really look after their brain health through their lifespan, what is the one tip that you would give?
There are a lot of stories that we tell ourselves that are not necessarily based on good data. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power of expectations. And that is not to dismiss other people's experiences or to say things are all in your head, but our brain is considering all sources of data and information when it creates an experience. There is the data and information that is coming from our bodies. There is the information and data making its way in through our senses from the outside world. That includes every experience we had as a child, growing up, education. And we've got these like devices that we hold in our hands, like a few feet away from our face now, that are streaming information from the world into our brain that our brain is considering and making meaning of. And then we've got like our top-down thoughts and experiences and expectations. And sometimes I think it's kind of good to take a bit of a scientist's kind of approach or mindset to weighing all of those pieces of information up when we consider our health. We tend to, as I said, just default to thinking that hormones, particularly estrogen, just this like the scapegoat, and blaming them and not understanding that, our brains are endocrine organs which react and respond and flex. But our brains are social organs which are paying just as much attention to other people around us and, the stories that they're telling us, and that context is mattering just as much as like this one kind of biological signal. And I think right now we're focusing a lot on that, sex hormones or women's health from a biological perspective, but we're more complicated than that. And we're not always about dysfunction and decline and instability. My brain isn't.
Flourishing, thriving, and adaptation.
Yeah. Resilient, responsive, flexible. That our brains will often perform well given the right stories.
And so the last question I leave you with is, if you can give me one sentence on this, you'll be very good at this. What does live well, be well mean to you?
Go to bed early and don't take yourself too seriously, please.
I love that. Going to bed early and not taking yourself too seriously is a great philosophy for life. And there's so much more. We could have done like a 4-hour episode on this.
No, we didn't cover we barely scratched the surface of the cortex.
We barely scratched the surface, but it just shows, how much work you've done in this area, how much need there is for this conversation. And, we're going to have to get you back on when you fly back to London, or if I come to Australia, because women need to feel more seen than ever before. And it's really exciting. It was definitely not a conversation that I expected on the fact of our projections. As much as I love Lisa Feldman Barrett, I didn't think it was going to cross over, pollinate into this episode. And I'm really surprised. It is, which is great.
I just want there to be some good news stories out there. And neuroscience is coming up with so many good news stories, and we're not hearing about them. And it's a shame. Because,
we are in this podcast.
So here I'm telling some, so maybe they might start shifting people's perspectives and expectations.
Yeah. Women to feel more powerful as they grow older and wiser.
Yeah, we're awesome.
We are awesome.
I
am. Well, everyone must get your next kind of 2 books, your next edition of Women's Health and Women's Brains.
Women's Brain Book.
The second edition.
Yeah.
And just quickly say about the new one that's coming out.
That is the new book that is coming out. So
isn't there the baby?
So the surprising neuroscience of how pregnancy and motherhood Sculpt Our Brains and Change Our Minds for the Better came out in 2023.
Okay.
Brain Health for Dummies, the For Dummies, Wiley, yellow and black For Dummies book came out in January 2025. And the second edition of the Women's Brain book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones and Happiness, came out or is about to come out in the next month.
So you just have too many books.
Well, there's 3. There's only 3. But
there's only 3 in 2 years. That's a lot.
Because the first book came out in 2018, but there was just so much new neuroscience since 2018. I had to do an update.
Love that. Which is amazing. And that makes me so happy that finally we can say there is some new research and funding into women's health.
God, there's so much, and there's so much more to come. And I just want to, and I don't know whether you're still recording at this point, but I have to just give the shout out to all of the scientists that are doing the work.
Okay, go.
Because I could not do what I do without their expertise and time and generosity, doing all of the work, and also talking to me and explaining their science and research. And I don't feel that they get enough credit because we keep talking about the gap as if no one's noticed it and no one's doing anything about it. And there is so much good science being done. So let's
give them a clap.
Applause.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited for this episode to come out and for everyone to hear it.